Jake Sullivan built his entire life on one belief: that the people you choose to trust are the closest thing to family a man can earn. He was not born into money. He was not handed a business, a network, or a head start. Everything he owned by the age of 43, he had built with his own two hands, one exhausting year at a time. And for 22 of those years, there was one person standing beside him through every version of that struggle. His best friend since the 5th grade, a man named Ryan Coleman. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Jake opened his laptop the same way he had opened it nearly every morning for the past 15 years. Coffee in one hand, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, ready to check the numbers on the business the two of them had built from a single rented garage into a company worth millions. Except this time, the numbers did not load the way they were supposed to. The account was empty. Not low, not tight. Empty. Every dollar the two men had earned together, gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. Jake's first thought was not betrayal. It was panic, the kind that comes from assuming a bank made a mistake, a system glitched, a transfer got delayed somewhere in the process. He picked up his phone and called the one person who would know exactly what happened, because that person had access to every account, every signature, every password. He called Ryan. The call did not go through. Not busy. Not declined. Disconnected, as if the number had simply stopped existing overnight, the same way the money had. What Jake did not know yet, sitting alone in that office at 7 in the morning with his coffee going cold beside him, was that this was not a mistake at all. This was the final step of something that had been carefully arranged behind his back for months. Paperwork he had never seen. Signatures that were not his, forged well enough to fool a bank teller who had known him personally for a decade. A company quietly registered under a different name, in a different state, funded entirely by money that used to belong to both of them, and now belonged to only one. 22 years of friendship, 15 years of blood, sweat, and a business built with his own two hands. It took his best friend 11 days to destroy all of it. Jake would spend the rest of that year learning the difference between the version of Ryan he thought he knew and the version of Ryan who had been planning his exit while sitting across the same dinner table, laughing at the same old jokes, holding his newborn niece, standing next to him at his own father's funeral only 14 months earlier. The betrayal was not sudden. It had been assembled quietly, piece by piece, by a man Jake had never once had a reason to doubt. This is not a story about a stranger who took advantage of a good man. Strangers are easy to guard against. This is a story about the person Jake trusted more than almost anyone else on earth. The one man who had stood beside him at his wedding, who had co-signed his first loan, who had promised, more than once, that whatever happened, the two of them were in this together until the end. It is a story about what happens to a man's sense of the world when the person closest to him turns out to be the one who takes it all away. And it does not end with the theft. Years later, after the lawsuits, after the foreclosure, after the marriage that did not survive the fallout, after Jake rebuilt a life he never imagined having to rebuild from nothing at 45 years old, Ryan came back. Not with the money. Not with an explanation that made any sense. He came back asking for something far harder to give than cash ever was. He came back asking to be forgiven. Before we go any further into how this friendship began and exactly how it came apart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to hear is the full story of how two boys who grew up 2 houses apart became the kind of friends people describe as brothers, how one of them built something worth protecting, how the other one decided it was worth stealing, and how a knock on a door years later forced Jake to answer a question most people never have to face in their entire lives. When someone takes everything from you and then asks for forgiveness, what do you actually owe them? Nothing, or everything you have left. To understand how something like this happens, you have to understand who these two men actually were before any of it fell apart. Jake Sullivan was the kind of man people described as steady, reliable to a fault. The guy who showed up early, paid his bills on time, and never once, in over 2 decades, gave anyone a reason to question his word. Ryan Coleman was different, though nobody saw it as a warning sign at the time. He was the charming one, the one with big ideas, bigger plans, and a talent for making everyone around him believe those plans were already halfway to happening. For most of their lives, that difference is exactly what made the friendship work. Jake built the foundation. Ryan sold the vision. Together, they turned a small idea neither of them could have pulled off alone into a company that supported both of their families for over a decade. On paper, it looked like the kind of partnership people spend their whole careers trying to find. Two men who balanced each other out perfectly, who trusted each other with everything, who had built something worth protecting long before either of them understood exactly what they had built. But somewhere along the way, that balance shifted. Nobody around them noticed it happening in real time, because betrayal on this scale rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, hidden inside ordinary conversations, inside late nights at the office that seemed normal at the time, inside a growing list of small decisions that only made sense once the full picture came into view. By the time Jake opened that laptop and found nothing left in the account, the plan behind it had already been years in the making. So the questions worth asking are not simple ones. What actually changed in Ryan, and when? Was there one moment, one decision, one piece of pressure in his life that pushed him toward a choice this extreme, or had the seeds of it been there far longer than anyone realized? And once the truth came out, once Jake lost the business, the house, and the marriage that could not survive what came after, how does a man ever get to a place where he can stand at someone's front door years later and ask to be forgiven for something like this? Those are the questions this story is going to answer. Not with speculation, but by walking through exactly what happened, in the order it happened, starting from the very beginning, back when Jake and Ryan were just two kids on the same street who had no idea how far their friendship would go or how far it would eventually fall. Jake Sullivan and Ryan Coleman met the way a lot of lifelong friendships start, without either of them realizing it was happening at all. They were 9 years old, living 2 houses apart on a quiet street outside Dayton, Ohio, in a neighborhood where fathers worked long shifts at the same handful of factories and mothers stretched every paycheck to cover the gap between what came in and what the family needed. Jake's father repaired heavy machinery. Ryan's father worked nights at a warehouse. Neither family had much, but neither family was unusual for that street, and neither boy grew up thinking of himself as poor. That was simply what life looked like. They became inseparable almost immediately, in the effortless way children do, riding bikes until the streetlights came on, trading baseball cards, building forts out of scrap wood behind Ryan's garage. But even at 9 years old, the people who knew them both noticed something. Jake was cautious. He counted his allowance twice before spending it. He finished his homework before he let himself go outside. Ryan was the opposite. He was the one climbing the tallest tree first, talking his way out of trouble with teachers twice his age, already dreaming out loud about the kind of life he wanted, long before he had any real plan for how to get there. By the time they reached high school, the friendship had settled into something closer to family. Jake's mother kept a plate ready for Ryan most Sunday nights, because more often than not, he showed up for dinner whether he was formally invited or not. Ryan's father, a man who was not naturally warm with his own son, still made a point of asking Jake how his grades were doing, the way a parent checks in on a kid he considers his own. Neither boy had a brother. Somewhere in those years, without either of them saying it out loud, they became each other's. There is a version of their story from that period that people who knew them both still talk about today. During their junior year, Jake's father was laid off for 4 months after an injury on the job, and the Sullivan family fell dangerously behind on rent. Ryan, 16 years old with no real money of his own, spent an entire summer working extra shifts at a gas station just to help cover part of the gap, never once telling Jake what he was doing until years later, when it came up almost by accident in a conversation. That is the kind of loyalty this friendship was built on. Quiet, unspoken, the kind that does not ask for credit. After high school, their paths diverged just enough to make the story interesting. Jake stayed close to home, working construction and eventually earning a certification in commercial electrical work, slowly building a reputation as someone contractors could trust to show up on time and do the job right the first time. Ryan left for 2 years, chasing a series of half-formed plans in Columbus that never quite worked out the way he described them. First a sales job that ended abruptly, then a short attempt at starting his own detailing business that folded within a year. He came back to Dayton at 23 with a business card, a car full of unpaid parking tickets, and a story about the experience being worth more than the outcome. Jake never once made him feel small for it. If anything, it deepened the loyalty between them, because Jake understood something about his friend that not everyone had the patience to see. Ryan was not lazy. He was not dishonest, not back then. He simply wanted more than the neighborhood they grew up in seemed willing to offer him, and he was still figuring out how to get it without a clear map for the road ahead. Jake, on the other hand, had never needed a map. He built things with his hands, and things built with your hands tend to hold together in a way that plans and pitches sometimes do not. It was Jake who first floated the idea that would eventually change both of their lives. He had been doing electrical work for smaller contractors for almost 6 years by then, watching the way those businesses were run, quietly cataloging everything he would do differently if the company were his own. One night, sitting on the back porch of Jake's rented duplex with a case of beer between them, he told Ryan he had saved enough to buy the tools and the truck needed to go out on his own. But he did not have the first idea how to find clients, price a job properly, or handle the business side of things. Ryan, without hesitating, said the same sentence he had said to Jake more than once over the years. "We should do this together." What made that moment matter is not that it was some grand, dramatic turning point. It was almost casual. Two friends in their late 20s, a little buzzed, a little hopeful, talking about a plan that felt more like a shared daydream than an actual business decision. But 3 weeks later, Ryan showed up at Jake's door with a folder of paperwork he had put together, licensing requirements, a rough cost breakdown for insurance, even a hand-drawn logo idea sketched on notebook paper. For a man who had never finished a single one of his own ventures, this was different. This time, it was not just his idea. It was theirs. That distinction turned out to matter more than either of them understood at the time. When something is only yours, walking away from it costs you nothing but pride. When something belongs to both of you, walking away means leaving a piece of another person behind with it. In the years that followed, that difference would become the exact thing that made their business succeed beyond what either man could have built alone. And it would also become, eventually, the exact thing that made the eventual betrayal so much harder to survive. Before we get into how that small idea on a back porch turned into a company worth millions, it is worth sitting for a moment on what these two men actually meant to each other by the time they started that business. Jake stood beside Ryan at his wedding 2 years later, not as a guest, but as his best man, giving a toast that made half the room cry, describing Ryan as the brother he never had but always needed. Ryan returned the favor 18 months after that, standing at Jake's own wedding, joking in his toast that he had personally guaranteed Jake would never be late again, because he had spent 20 years dragging him out the door on time. Neither man could have known, standing in those rented tuxedos on 2 separate wedding days, smiling for photographs that both families would keep for decades, that everything they were building together, the business, the trust, the years of showing up for each other without being asked, was quietly setting the stage for a loss neither of them could have imagined surviving. Not yet. That part of the story was still years away. But it is worth remembering these early years clearly, because everything that comes next only makes sense once you understand exactly how much these two men had, and exactly how much there eventually was to lose. The company started with $11,000, a used pickup truck, and a set of tools Jake had been collecting for 6 years while he worked for other people. They called it Sullivan and Coleman Electrical, a name Ryan pushed for even though Jake initially argued his own name should not go first. Ryan's answer to that argument became something of a running joke between them for years afterward. He told Jake plainly that his name belonged first because he was the one who actually knew how to do the work, and Ryan's job was simply to make sure people found out about it. That division of labor, one man building, one man selling, became the engine that drove everything that followed. The first year was brutal in the way small businesses almost always are, even for people who work hard and do everything right. Jake was out on job sites from 6 in the morning until dark, wiring houses, running conduit, taking on any residential job he could find because commercial contracts were still out of reach for a company with no track record. Ryan spent his days doing something just as exhausting in its own way: cold calling contractors, showing up uninvited to job sites with business cards in hand, sitting through rejection after rejection with the same unshakable confidence that had defined him since childhood. Neither man paid himself a real salary for the first 14 months. Both of their wives worked full-time to cover the gap. There was a night, still talked about by both families today, when the business came within days of folding entirely. A commercial client who owed them nearly $20,000 for completed work filed for bankruptcy before paying the invoice, leaving Jake and Ryan holding a debt they had no way to absorb. Jake wanted to shut it down right there, cut their losses, and go back to working for someone else where a paycheck was guaranteed. Ryan refused. He sat across from Jake at that same kitchen table where the idea had first been sketched on notebook paper, and told him they had not come this far to quit over one bad client. He personally called 6 different vendors, negotiated extended payment terms on every single one, and somehow kept the doors open for another 90 days, just long enough for 2 new contracts to come through and save the company. That moment mattered more than either man understood at the time, because it became the story they told themselves and everyone else about who they were as partners. Jake built things that lasted. Ryan found a way through when everything looked finished. For years, that story held up perfectly, because for years, it was true. By their 3rd year in business, Sullivan and Coleman Electrical had grown from a 2-man operation working out of a garage into a company with 4 employees and a real office space. A converted storefront on the edge of downtown Dayton that Ryan insisted on renting long before they could technically afford it, arguing that a business had to look successful before it could actually become successful. The turning point that pushed them from a small local operation into something much bigger came in their 5th year, when they landed a contract to handle the electrical work on a new mixed-use development on the north side of the city, a job worth more than the company had earned in its first 3 years combined. Jake still remembers standing in the parking lot after signing that contract, both men too stunned to speak for a full minute before Ryan finally broke the silence by asking if they were allowed to feel this excited about wiring a strip mall. It became a private joke between them for years, a shorthand for how far they had come from 2 broke kids splitting a case of beer on a back porch. From there, the growth compounded quickly. More contracts led to more employees. More employees led to a larger office. And within 8 years of that first $11,000 investment, Sullivan and Coleman Electrical had become one of the most respected commercial electrical contractors in the region, employing over 30 people and generating revenue neither man could have realistically imagined back when they were splitting gas station shifts just to help each other's families make rent. Jake's role settled into overseeing operations and quality control, making sure every job that went out under their name met the standard he had built his entire reputation on. Ryan took over the business side almost entirely, handling client relationships, contracts, and eventually, without either of them making a formal decision about it, the company's finances. That last part deserves to be said plainly, because it becomes important later in this story. Jake was never particularly interested in the financial side of the business. Numbers, spreadsheets, tax filings, none of it excited him the way a well-run job site did. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed genuinely comfortable with it, and over time, without any real conversation about the shift, he simply became the partner who handled the money. Bank access, vendor payments, payroll, tax preparation. All of it slowly migrated into Ryan's hands, not because Jake was careless, but because he trusted his best friend completely. And after 20 years of Ryan proving that trust was earned, there was no reason in Jake's mind to think twice about it. It is worth pausing here to say something clearly. None of this made Jake naive. Trusting your business partner with the finances of a company you built together is not a mistake. It is how most successful partnerships actually function. Millions of businesses across this country operate exactly this way, with one partner handling operations and the other handling money, without a single problem, for decades. What happened to Jake was not the result of poor judgment. It was the result of a friendship that had earned 22 years of proof, being tested by a version of Ryan that had not existed for most of those 22 years, but was quietly beginning to take shape underneath the surface of a life that, from the outside, still looked exactly the same as it always had. By their 11th year in business, Sullivan and Coleman Electrical had expanded into a second office 2 counties over, and both men were finally living the kind of life that decade of unpaid overtime had promised them. Jake bought a house on 4 acres outside the city, the first home he had ever owned outright. Ryan traded in his old truck for something newer every couple of years, sent his 2 kids to a private school across town, and became known around Dayton as one of the more visible, well-liked small business owners in the area, the kind of guy who sponsored a little league team and showed up to the ribbon cuttings of other people's businesses just to be supportive. From the outside, nothing about Ryan's life looked any different than it had for the previous decade. He still showed up to the office most mornings before 8. He still called Jake most weekends just to talk, the way he had since they were kids. But underneath that surface, something had started shifting, quietly enough that even the people closest to him did not notice right away. Ryan had developed a habit of disappearing for a few hours on weeknights that he explained away as client dinners or late meetings, explanations nobody had any reason to question, because he had never once given anyone a reason not to trust his word. What Jake did not know, and would not fully understand until much later, was that Ryan had developed a serious gambling habit over the previous 2 years, one that started small, a few hands of poker with old friends from high school, and slowly escalated into something he could no longer control on his own. By the time anyone close to him recognized the pattern for what it was, Ryan had already lost a significant amount of his personal savings, money that had nothing to do with the business, money he had every right to lose on his own if that was the choice he wanted to make. The problem was that personal losses on that scale rarely stay contained to one part of a person's life. Ryan started missing mortgage payments on his own home without telling his wife the real reason why. He took out a personal loan he did not disclose to anyone, using it to cover gambling debts he was too ashamed to explain to the people who loved him. And somewhere in that same stretch of time, sitting alone in the office late one night with full access to every account the business owned, Ryan made a decision that would take more than a year to fully play out. A decision that started small enough that he likely told himself, at least at first, that he would pay it back before anyone noticed it was ever gone. Jake, for his part, noticed almost nothing during this period, and there is no reason he should have. Ryan had handled the company's finances competently for over a decade without a single issue. There had never been a missed payment, a late tax filing, an unhappy vendor. The trust between them was not blind faith built on nothing. It was trust earned through more than 20 years of consistent proof, which is exactly what made it so easy for Ryan to exploit once he decided to. A stranger could not have gotten away with what Ryan was about to do. It took someone who had spent 2 decades proving he never needed to be checked on. There was one moment during this period that Jake would only fully understand the significance of much later. At a routine partner meeting roughly 8 months before everything fell apart, Ryan suggested they streamline the company's banking structure, consolidating several accounts into a system he described as more efficient for tax purposes, one that would give him slightly broader authority to move funds between accounts without requiring a second signature on every transaction. At the time, it sounded like exactly the kind of practical, detail-oriented suggestion Ryan had made 100 times before. Jake signed off on it without hesitation, the same way he had signed off on nearly every financial decision Ryan had proposed for over a decade. It never once occurred to him to ask why. The first real sign that something was wrong came roughly 2 months before the account emptied out completely. And like most warning signs in hindsight, it was small enough at the time to explain away without much thought. A longtime supplier called the office asking about a payment that was 3 weeks late, something that had never happened once in the 11 years Sullivan and Coleman Electrical had worked with that company. Jake took the call himself, apologized, and walked straight into Ryan's office to ask what had happened. Ryan barely looked up from his computer, blaming a processing delay with the bank, promising it would be resolved by the end of the week. It was, and Jake never thought about it again. A few weeks later, a second supplier called with the same complaint, a late payment, an apology requested, a promise that it was simply an administrative mix-up. This time, Jake mentioned it to his wife over dinner, more out of mild irritation than any real concern, the kind of comment a business owner makes about a minor inconvenience rather than a warning sign of something serious. Looking back on it later, Jake would describe that moment as the first time a small, quiet part of him noticed something felt slightly off, a feeling he dismissed almost as quickly as it appeared, because dismissing it was so much easier than the alternative. Around this same time, people close to Ryan started noticing changes in him that had nothing to do with the business directly. He seemed distracted during conversations that used to hold his full attention. He was short with his wife over small things that never used to bother him. He started arriving at the office later than usual, sometimes not at all, offering vague explanations about client meetings that, when checked later, did not always line up. None of this, on its own, was enough to raise real alarm. People go through difficult stretches. Marriages hit rough patches. Business owners get overwhelmed. Every excuse fit neatly into a story that did not require anyone to ask harder questions, because nobody wanted to believe the harder question was necessary. The moment that finally broke through Jake's trust came almost by accident, 3 weeks before the account went empty. He was reviewing a routine insurance renewal document that required him to confirm the company's current asset value, something he normally would have handed off entirely, but the insurance agent needed his signature directly rather than Ryan's for this particular form. While reviewing the numbers to make sure they matched what he understood the business to be worth, Jake noticed a figure that did not add up. A transfer, dated 4 months earlier, moving a substantial sum out of the company's primary operating account into an account Jake did not recognize. He assumed, at first, that it had to be a clerical error, a mislabeled internal transfer between accounts that had simply been set up under an unfamiliar name during that banking restructure Ryan had proposed months earlier. He told himself this so convincingly that he almost did not follow up on it at all. But something about the number stayed with him through the rest of that day, sitting in the back of his mind the way an unanswered question does when part of you already suspects the answer will not be the one you are hoping for. That night, unable to shake the feeling, Jake pulled up the online banking portal on his own laptop, using login credentials he had not personally used in years, credentials that technically still belonged to him as an equal owner of the company. He typed in the account number from the document, the one attached to that unfamiliar transfer, and sat there for a long moment before finally hitting enter. What came back on the screen was not a clerical error. It was a second business account, registered under a name Jake had never heard before, funded entirely by transfers pulled quietly from the company he and Ryan had spent 22 years building together. Jake picked up his phone that night, and for the first time since they were 9 years old, he called his best friend with a question he already suspected he did not want answered. The discovery, narrator voiceover, 50:00, 58:00. Ryan answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the same easy tone it always had, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Jake asked him directly about the account, about the name he did not recognize, about the transfer dated 4 months earlier. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough for Jake to feel something shift in his stomach before Ryan said it was nothing, a temporary holding account set up for a supplier arrangement he had been meaning to explain, something he promised to walk Jake through in full detail at the office the next morning. Jake wanted to believe him. 22 years of trust does not disappear over one uneasy phone call. He told himself he would get the full explanation in the morning, and he almost managed to fall asleep believing that. The explanation never came, because by 7 the next morning, Ryan was not at the office, and by 8, he was not answering his phone at all. Jake drove to Ryan's house himself, something he had not needed to do in years, only to find the driveway empty and no one answering the door. It was at that point, standing on the porch of a house he had visited hundreds of times over 2 decades, that the uneasy feeling from the night before hardened into something closer to dread. Jake got in his car, drove straight to the office, and this time, instead of trusting Ryan's explanation, he called their accountant directly and asked for a full, immediate review of every account tied to the business. What came back over the following 72 hours was worse than anything Jake had allowed himself to consider possible. The unfamiliar account was not a holding account for a supplier arrangement. It was a separate company entirely, registered under a name close enough to their own that a distracted eye could easily overlook the difference, funded by more than a dozen transfers made over the previous 11 months, each one just small enough to avoid triggering the kind of automatic flag a single large transfer might have caused. Individually, none of the transfers looked alarming. Together, they added up to just under $1,400,000, nearly the entire cash reserve the company had spent 2 decades building. The accountant found something else during that review that turned Jake's stomach in an entirely different way. Several of the authorization documents tied to those transfers carried Jake's signature, on paperwork he had never seen, approving decisions he had never made. A closer comparison made it clear almost immediately that the signature was not his at all, close enough to pass a quick glance, but forged with a level of familiarity that could only come from someone who had spent decades watching Jake sign his name on contracts, insurance forms, and loan documents. It was not a stranger's forgery. It was the forgery of a man who knew exactly how Jake wrote every letter of his own name. By the 3rd day, a private investigator Jake hired confirmed the last piece of the picture. Roughly 6 weeks earlier, Ryan had quietly listed and sold a piece of property the 2 men jointly owned, a small commercial lot they had purchased years earlier as a long-term investment, using a power of attorney document Jake had signed years before for an entirely unrelated purpose and had completely forgotten still existed. The proceeds from that sale, just over $300,000, had been transferred into the same unfamiliar account, bringing the total amount Ryan had quietly taken to just under $1.7 million. Jake sat in his accountant's office when that final number was read out loud to him, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. 22 years of friendship, 15 years of a business built with his own hands, reduced, in less than 2 weeks, to a number on a page and a phone that no longer rang through. The man Jake had trusted more than almost anyone else on earth had not made one desperate mistake in a moment of panic. He had built an exit, piece by piece, over the better part of a year, using the exact trust that 22 years of friendship had earned him, and by the time Jake understood what had actually happened, Ryan was already gone. Ryan's disappearance was not gradual. It was complete, and it happened almost overnight. His phone stayed disconnected. His house, the one Jake had driven to that first morning, remained empty for days, curtains drawn, mail piling up untouched on the porch. His wife, who Jake had known for nearly 15 years, stopped answering calls from anyone connected to the business, including Jake himself. Word eventually came back through a mutual friend that she and the children had gone to stay with her parents out of state, and that she claimed to have known nothing about what Ryan had done, a claim that would later hold up under the investigation that followed. Employees at Sullivan and Coleman Electrical learned what happened the same way most of the community eventually did, through a mix of rumor and slowly confirmed fact. Payroll for that period barely cleared, saved only by an emergency line of credit Jake secured within days by putting up his own home as collateral. Several employees who had been with the company for over a decade, people who had watched both men build the business from nothing, described the following weeks as watching a slow-motion collapse of something they assumed was untouchable. One longtime foreman later said in an interview that looking back, there had been small signs, moments where Ryan seemed distracted or evasive in the months leading up to it. Signs that meant nothing at the time and meant everything in hindsight. Jake hired a lawyer within the first week, and that conversation delivered a second blow almost as painful as the theft itself. The lawyer explained, as gently as the situation allowed, that while the forged signatures and unauthorized transfers were unquestionably criminal, actually recovering the money would be an entirely separate and far more difficult battle. Ryan had moved quickly enough and structured the transfers carefully enough that a significant portion of the funds had already been converted, spent, or moved into accounts that would take months, possibly years, of legal work to even locate, let alone reclaim. Filing criminal charges might eventually lead to an arrest. It offered no guarantee of ever seeing a single dollar of that money again. There was a night, about 2 weeks into all of this, when Jake drove out to Ryan's empty house one more time, alone, well past midnight. For no clear reason he could fully explain afterward except that some part of him was still looking for an answer standing in that driveway that no phone call or legal document could give him. He sat in his car outside the house for nearly an hour, staring at the dark windows of a home he had eaten dinner in more times than he could count, trying to reconcile the man who had stood beside him at his wedding with the man who had apparently spent the better part of a year planning to disappear with everything they had built together. He never got out of the car. Eventually, he just drove home. What made the following months so difficult was not only the financial devastation, though that alone was significant enough to reshape the rest of Jake's life. It was the absence of any explanation at all. No confrontation. No apology. No final conversation where Ryan looked him in the eye and admitted what he had done. Just silence, an empty house, and a legal case that would take years to fully resolve, if it ever resolved at all. Ryan had not just taken the money. He had taken the ending, the closure, the basic human decency of an explanation that even people who commit terrible acts usually owe the person standing across from them. Jake was left to rebuild his entire life without ever getting to ask his best friend, to his face, the one question that mattered more than any of the money. Why? What people outside a situation like this often fail to understand is that the theft itself is only the beginning. The real damage unfolds slowly, over months and years, in a series of smaller losses that compound on top of each other until the original number on the page stops feeling like the worst part of the story at all. For Jake, the collapse of Sullivan and Coleman Electrical did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one taking something else from him that he had spent decades building, until very little of the life he recognized was left standing. The business itself survived less than a year past the discovery. Without the cash reserves Ryan had drained, and without the second partner who had handled every client relationship the company depended on, Jake found himself trying to run an operation that had never been designed for one person to manage alone. He worked 18-hour days for months, personally taking on client meetings he had never handled before, learning financial systems he had spent 20 years happily avoiding, doing everything possible to keep 30 employees and their families afloat. It was not enough. Contracts began slipping to competitors. Vendors, spooked by the public unraveling of the partnership, grew hesitant to extend the same credit terms. Within 14 months, Jake made the decision he had fought against for as long as he possibly could, and closed the company his own name had been on the door of for over 2 decades. The house went next, the 4 acres Jake had bought as the first real proof that all those years of hard work had meant something. He had used it as collateral for the emergency credit line that kept payroll running in those first desperate weeks, a decision that felt necessary at the time and became devastating over the following year, as the business failed and the loan came due with no way left to cover it. Jake, his wife, and their 2 children moved into a rental home on the other side of town, the kind of modest place Jake had lived in decades earlier, before any of this began, a fact that was not lost on him during the long nights he spent unable to sleep in an unfamiliar bedroom. The marriage did not survive what came after, though it would be unfair to say the money alone was responsible. What the ordeal actually did was strip away the version of Jake his wife had built a life alongside for nearly 2 decades, a steady, unshakable man who had never once given her reason to worry about the ground underneath them. In his place was someone consumed by stress, working impossible hours trying to salvage what could not be salvaged, distant in a way he had never been before, carrying a grief he did not know how to talk about because it did not fit neatly into any category people know how to comfort. They separated 18 months after the theft was discovered and divorced a year after that, a loss Jake has said publicly, in the years since, hurt him nearly as much as everything else combined. Through all of it, Jake had almost no information about where Ryan actually was. Rumors circulated constantly in a small community like theirs, each one impossible to confirm. None of it was confirmed. None of it mattered, in the way that actually would have helped Jake move forward. What he needed was not rumors about where Ryan had gone. What he needed was some version of understanding, some way to make sense of how a person he had trusted for 22 years could do this to him. And that understanding simply was not available. Not yet. For nearly 3 years, Jake lived with the financial wreckage, the broken marriage, and an unanswered question that followed him into every quiet moment of his day. And then, on an ordinary evening that started out exactly like every other evening before it, there was a knock on his door. The criminal case against Ryan moved forward even without his physical presence, built almost entirely on the paperwork trail Jake's accountant and lawyer had assembled in those first frantic weeks. Forgery charges were filed within 2 months of the discovery, along with a civil suit aimed at recovering whatever assets could still be traced. On paper, this sounds like a straightforward process. In practice, it became one of the most exhausting stretches of Jake's life, a slow grind through a legal system that moves at its own pace regardless of how urgently a person needs answers. The first Betrayal lead came 4 months in, when investigators traced a portion of the missing funds to a bank in a neighboring state, tied to an account opened under a name close enough to Ryan's own that it was almost certainly him, using a slight variation to avoid basic searches. For a brief moment, it felt like the case might resolve quickly. That hope collapsed within weeks, when it became clear the account had already been closed out. The funds moved again, this time through a chain of transactions complicated enough that even Jake's forensic accountant admitted it would take considerable time to fully unravel. This pattern repeated itself more than once over the following 2 years. A tip would surface, sometimes from a former employee, sometimes from an old mutual acquaintance who claimed to have spotted Ryan somewhere unexpected, and each time, Jake allowed himself a small amount of hope that this might finally be the lead that brought some resolution. Each time, the lead either turned out to be mistaken entirely, a case of someone who simply resembled Ryan, or it led to a location Ryan had already left behind weeks or months earlier, always one step ahead of anyone actually looking for him. A court date was finally set roughly 18 months into the process, and for the first time since everything fell apart, Jake allowed himself to believe an ending was actually in sight. He prepared for weeks, working with his lawyer to organize testimony, reviewing the financial records one more time, bracing himself for what it would feel like to stand in the same room as Ryan again for the first time since that unanswered phone call. 3 days before the hearing, it was postponed, a procedural delay tied to Ryan's continued absence and the difficulty of formally serving him with the necessary legal documents while his location remained unknown. Jake has described that postponement, in interviews given later, as one of the lowest points of the entire ordeal, worse in some ways than the original discovery, because it represented hope being built up carefully over months and then taken away in a single phone call from his attorney. Over those same 2 years, Jake's legal team did manage to recover a portion of the stolen funds, primarily through the forced liquidation of assets connected to the shell company Ryan had originally set up. It amounted to just under $400,000, a meaningful sum on its own, but a fraction of the nearly $1.7 million originally taken, and nowhere close to enough to undo the damage that had already been done to the business, the house, or the marriage that had not survived the fallout. Jake has said that receiving that partial recovery felt less like justice and more like a reminder of everything that could never actually be returned to him. By the time the 3rd year arrived, the case had settled into a kind of quiet limbo. The civil judgment against Ryan remained on record, a legal acknowledgement of what he had done and what he owed, but with no clear path toward actually collecting it. The criminal charges remained active, waiting on an arrest that investigators privately admitted might never happen unless Ryan resurfaced somewhere that brought him back into contact with the legal system. Jake had, by this point, made a kind of uneasy peace with the idea that this chapter of his life might simply remain unresolved forever, a debt on paper that would never be paid, a question that would never be answered, a friendship that would end in silence rather than any kind of real conclusion. That is exactly the state of mind Jake was in on the evening the knock finally came. Not hopeful, not expecting anything, just a man who had spent 3 years learning to live inside an unfinished story, about to find out that the story was not actually finished at all. For 3 years, Ryan Coleman had been little more than a rumor to the people who once knew him, a name attached to secondhand stories nobody could confirm, a man who seemed to have simply erased himself from the life he used to live. But somewhere during those same 3 years, while Jake was rebuilding a life out of what remained, Ryan was living through a collapse of his own, one that had almost nothing to do with the legal case chasing him and everything to do with the same problem that started this entire chain of events in the first place. What happened to the man who walked away with nearly $2 million was not the story anyone close to him expected. And by the time he found himself standing outside Jake's front door, Ryan was not returning as a man who had gotten away with something. He was returning as a man who had lost almost everything a second time and had nowhere else left to go. In the first few months after disappearing, Ryan did exactly what investigators eventually pieced together, moving to a small city several hours away, settling under a name close enough to his own to avoid immediate suspicion, but different enough to slip past routine searches. He used part of the stolen money to put a down payment on a modest house, and within a year, started a small landscaping business, drawing on skills he had picked up managing crews during his years running Sullivan and Coleman Electrical. For a while, from the outside, it looked like Ryan had actually pulled off the thing he set out to do. A fresh start, funded by a fortune that used to belong to someone else. What nobody around him in that new life knew, including the small handful of new friends and one serious relationship he formed during that period, was that the gambling problem that had quietly destroyed his first life had never actually gone away. If anything, Having access to a large sum of money for the first time in years gave it more room to grow than it had ever had before. Ryan told himself, in the beginning, that he was simply enjoying a bit of the freedom he felt he had earned. Within 18 months, a significant portion of what remained of the stolen money was gone, lost across casino floors and increasingly reckless online betting. The exact same pattern that had started this entire story, only now playing out with no legitimate business left to quietly drain when the losses piled up. The new landscaping business began struggling not long after, starved of the reinvestment it needed because Ryan was funneling money elsewhere. Employees went unpaid on more than one occasion. A key piece of equipment was repossessed after payments lapsed. The woman he had been building a relationship with during that period ended things after discovering the extent of the gambling. A conversation that, by Ryan's own later account, felt disturbingly familiar, an echo of every warning sign he had ignored in his first marriage years earlier. By the end of the second year in his new life, the business had failed entirely, and what remained of the stolen money, once just under $1.7 million, had shrunk to almost nothing. The final blow came roughly 6 months before Ryan showed up at Jake's door, when a routine medical visit turned into a diagnosis that forced him to confront his situation in a way nothing else had managed to. It was not immediately life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require ongoing treatment Ryan had no insurance to cover and no meaningful savings left to pay for out-of-pocket. For the first time since the day he emptied that account, Ryan found himself in a position frighteningly similar to where he and Jake had started together as teenagers, broke, afraid, and without the one person who had always found a way through difficult moments standing beside him. It would be easy to frame this as simple justice, a man who took everything from his best friend, eventually losing everything himself. But the truth sitting underneath that neat narrative is more complicated and more human than a straightforward morality tale. Ryan's collapse was not some cosmic correction restoring balance to the world. It was the direct, predictable result of an addiction he never actually confronted, one that had already cost him his integrity, his friendship, and his family once, and was now finishing the job on the second life he had tried to build with what remained. Understanding that distinction matters, because it shapes everything about what happened next, when a man with genuinely nothing left showed up asking the one person he had betrayed for something money could never buy him back. It was a Thursday evening in early autumn when Jake heard the knock. He was not expecting anyone, and had just sat down to eat dinner alone in the modest rental home he had lived in for the past 2 years, a home that had slowly, quietly become something closer to his own again after everything that happened. He opened the door expecting a neighbor, or perhaps a delivery he had forgotten about, and instead found himself looking at a man he almost did not recognize at first. Ryan had lost considerable weight. His hair had gone mostly gray. He stood on the porch in clothes that looked slept in, and for what felt like a full minute, neither man said a single word. Jake has described that moment, in the time since, as one of the strangest experiences of his life, standing face to face with someone he had spent 3 years imagining 100 different confrontations with, and finding that in the actual moment, none of the anger he expected to feel arrived the way he thought it would. What arrived instead was something closer to disbelief, the simple, overwhelming strangeness of seeing a ghost standing on his front steps in the fading evening light. Ryan spoke first, and what he said was not an excuse. He told Jake he was not there to ask for money, that he understood there was nothing he could offer that would come close to undoing what he had done. He said he had spent the last several months, since receiving his diagnosis, forced to sit with the full weight of his own choices in a way the chaos of the previous years had always let him avoid. He told Jake, plainly and without dressing it up, about the gambling, about how it had never actually stopped, about the business that failed and the relationship that ended and the diagnosis that finally made him stop running from what he had become. He did not ask Jake to understand. He said he knew understanding was not something anyone could reasonably ask for, not after what he had done. What he asked for, standing on that porch with nothing left to offer but the truth, was simply the chance to say he was sorry to Jake's face, something he said he should have found the courage to do 3 years earlier instead of disappearing the way he did. He told Jake he did not expect forgiveness, and that he would leave immediately if that was what Jake wanted, but that he could not keep living with himself without at least saying it out loud, in person, one time. Jake stood in that doorway for a long time before he said anything back. 22 years of friendship stood on one side of that conversation. Nearly $2 million, a failed marriage, a lost business, and 3 years of unanswered questions stood on the other. There was no version of this moment that could make both of those things true at once without something inside Jake having to give way. He has said since that in that silence, standing across from the man who had once been the closest thing he had to a brother, he was not thinking about the money at all. He was thinking about a 16-year-old kid working extra shifts at a gas station, decades ago, just to help his family make rent, and trying to understand how that same person had become someone capable of what happened next. What Jake decided in that moment surprised almost everyone who heard about it afterward, including members of his own family. He did not slam the door. He did not embrace Ryan the way old friends do after years apart. He did something quieter, and in its own way, harder than either of those reactions would have been. He asked Ryan to sit down on the porch steps, and for the first time in 3 years, the two men talked, not as business partners, not as victim and offender, but as two people who had once known each other better than almost anyone else on earth. Jake has been clear, in the time since, that what happened on that porch was not forgiveness in the way people often imagine it, a clean, immediate release of every ounce of anger and grief the betrayal had caused. He told Ryan directly that he did not know if he would ever fully get past what had happened, and that trust, once broken this completely, does not simply return because someone finally says the right words. What he offered instead was something smaller, and in some ways more honest. He told Ryan he was willing to talk, willing to hear the rest of what he had to say over time, and willing to see, slowly, whether any version of their friendship could exist again, without pretending the last 3 years had not happened. He did not offer him money. He did not offer him a place to stay, or a job, or anything resembling the safety net Ryan had once been able to count on without asking. What Jake offered was simply his continued presence, an open door rather than a closed one, and the acknowledgement that the man standing in front of him, for all he had done, was still connected to 22 years of a life Jake was not ready to erase entirely, no matter how badly he had been hurt. It was not the ending anyone watching from the outside would have written for this story. It was, according to Jake, the only ending that actually felt honest. In the months that followed that conversation on the porch, Jake and Ryan slowly rebuilt something, though neither man would describe it as the same friendship they once had. They speak occasionally, mostly by phone, sometimes over coffee when Ryan is in town visiting the treatment program he eventually enrolled in for both his gambling addiction and the medical condition he had been ignoring for too long. Jake has never gone back into business with him, and has said plainly that he does not expect that to change. The company they built together no longer exists in any form. What exists instead is something smaller and more fragile, a relationship between two men who share more history than almost anyone else in either of their lives, carefully feeling out whether any part of that history is worth preserving going forward. Financially, Jake has never fully recovered what was taken from him, and likely never will. The civil judgment against Ryan remains largely uncollected, since Ryan has little left to pay it with. Jake rebuilt his career instead, taking a position managing electrical operations for a much larger regional contractor, a job with none of the ownership or independence he once had, but one that has allowed him, slowly, to stabilize his life and provide for his children. He has said in the years since that the hardest part was never actually the money. It was learning how to trust his own judgment again, after trusting it completely got him betrayed by the one person he never thought capable of it. Ryan, for his part, has spent the time since that reunion trying to build something closer to accountability than to redemption, a distinction he has said matters deeply to him now in a way it never did before. He attends regular meetings for his gambling addiction. He works a modest job that gives him little room for the kind of financial risk that destroyed both of his previous lives. He has not asked Jake for anything beyond the conversations they still occasionally share, and has said publicly that he does not believe he is owed forgiveness, only the ongoing opportunity to prove, slowly and without shortcuts, that the man who showed up on that porch was telling the truth about wanting to change. Stories like this one rarely offer a clean answer, and maybe that is the actual point of telling them at all. Jake did not get his money back. He did not get the business back, or the marriage, or the 22 years he spent believing his trust in another person was unbreakable. What he got instead was a choice, one nobody could make for him, about whether the worst thing a person ever does to you has to be the only thing that defines who they still are. Some people watching this will believe Jake gave Ryan more grace than he deserved. Others will understand exactly why he did it, because cutting away someone who was once your family is its own kind of loss, even when they are the one who caused all the damage in the first place. There is no version of this story where everyone agrees on the right answer, and that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Would you have opened that door the way Jake did? Would you have been able to sit down on those porch steps and actually listen? Or would you have closed the door and never looked back? There is no wrong answer here, only the honest one, whatever that turns out to be for you. If this story affected you the way it affected everyone who worked on telling it, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Jake's position. And if you have ever lived through a betrayal like this yourself, we would genuinely like to hear that story too. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.